Welcome to the Essay Writing Skills Workshop here. Obviously running this one for free just to hopefully help out all of you here today, help you touch things up as you prepare for your trials. And of course, it's really important that you go through each essay very carefully, you go through your drafts and put in the effort to actually improve them step by step. A lot of people just kind of put a draft together and they think that's good enough. It's all about writing a draft and then going back through it sentence by sentence, paragraph by paragraph, and polishing it up, getting people to look at it, going through things that we'll cover today and improving the quality of those. Now, implicit in what I just said is that you have a draft for each one. And of course, that's the starting point. Before we even get into my kind of top 10 tips and strategies to approach this, but the thing I would encourage you to do is to have one core draft essay for each of the three essay-based modules. You've got the common module, you've got module A, and you've got module B. So hopefully you're all very familiar with that. 60 marks out of the 100 marks in your exam and your trials and your HSC, that is, are going to be derived from an essay style assessment, right? There are 3 essays worth 20 marks, the craft of writing is worth 20 marks, and the short answer section is also worth 20 marks, and that makes up your 100 marks. But that means that 60% of your total HSC mark comes from essay writing. For those 3 20-mark essays, the beauty of it is that you can actually have a core draft essay that you've memorized for each one and that you've practiced adapting to different questions, and you can take that into the exam and have a pretty good crack at getting close to full marks, if not full marks. There's nothing bad about memorizing one core draft essay as long as you've also done the work to time it, cut it down, and practice adapting it to different types of questions so that you're flexible on the day and you're not simply regurgitating the essay that you memorized. The reason you want to memorize an essay is because it's going to save you a lot of time. It's not so that you already have the essay done, because you don't. You're going to need to answer a new question that you haven't seen before, most likely. So the idea is that you have a short essay memorized, or shorter essay in terms of the time. It's not going to be 40 minutes, it would be less than that, and we'll cover that in a second. But you have these shorter version draft essays, one for each of the modules, that you have polished over time and perfected, hopefully, or got it close to perfection. Again, by applying what we covered today and by getting feedback from teachers and other sources. And then memorizing that, committing that to memory, that's a pretty grueling process, because you're probably thinking that's 3 essays I have to memorize completely before the days of my exams. And that's true. That will take a lot of time. So you've got to make sure you allow at least 1 week, if not 2 weeks before your English exam, to memorize those 3 essays, plus craft of writing as well. Craft of writing we're not going to go over today, but I also would recommend memorizing at least one core draft for your preferred text type there, and then knowing how you would adapt it to other forms, as well as the reflection statement in case you are asked to do that as well. So there's actually 4 to 5 different things you have to memorize. Just factor that into your study plans. That's why I'm saying this now. You need to develop these core drafts, and you need to make sure you have enough time before the day of your exam to memorize it all. So it's really like a 2-week memorization process, in my opinion. Now, when you're memorizing it, you should also be looking at other questions and practicing adapting as you go. You do those things simultaneously. You're getting yourself into the mindset to adapt whilst learning that core material so that you're much faster on the day, and you don't have to be thinking back to quotes and thinking about how you're going to start your sentence. Sentence starters, quotes, how you kind of transition into your explanation, all of that can be locked in, and you can basically reuse that with almost any question. What you're going to have to change is how you explain your evidence and the precise wording of your topic sentences, thesis statements. But you can still have a base structure for every single sentence that you're going to reuse. It's just the precise wording, the way you actually say it, that will have to be adapted based on the new key terms of the question. So with Module C, I would start with your preferred text type or genre or style, however you want to call it. That means that you pick out of the imaginative, discursive, persuasive. You pick one of those 3 to start with. I would just do one version for that, but I would make sure that that one draft, I wouldn't do 3 different storylines or anything like that. I would do one, but I would make sure that it's very closely tied to what the prescribed text you've been looking at was based on. Because that way you're ensuring against the risk of being asked a question that actually asks you to use a character or a persona from a prescribed text from Module C, because that can be asked. If you're given a general stimulus that allows you to write about whatever you want, it doesn't matter that you're writing about something that's similar to what you studied in the prescribed text. So I would actually not only use the stylistic features from the prescribed text, but I would actually use almost a similar storyline or argument. It's not always going to be a story, is it? Because you might be doing a discursive or persuasive, but I would be talking about a similar thing. It's not just a matter of, learning a few different types in case different questions come up. It's saying learn one, but make sure you're smart about the one that you do. Make sure it has some relevance and connection to what the text you studied was about. The other element of that is you have that one core draft, but that only prepares you for that one text type. So you also then need to look at the other two and think, well, how would I remold it? How would I talk about the same thing in substance? How would I explore the same issue or theme in a different way, in a discursive form? And then how do I make that more persuasive? Now we've got a couple of hours factored into one of the other workshops we're doing, which I encourage you all to attend. It's on short answers and the craft of writing, and we'll go through all of these things. But there are some simple things you can do to transition from one draft to another so that you don't have to learn 3 entirely different pieces to cover an imaginative, a discursive, a persuasive. In fact, the discursive and the persuasive actually transition really nicely. There are just some subtle changes that you want to familiarize yourself with so that you can make sure that you are in fact writing persuasively rather than discursively. But you don't need to change what that piece was actually about or what you were exploring. It's just subtle changes so that the delivery is different. The imaginative is kind of in its own category because it's more of a story that you're building, although it's a very short story, and I wouldn't even think about it as a story. It's like a moment in time in a story, but there needs to be some kind of set-in, a minor aspect of plot there, but that can still be exploring the same issue that you would have discussed in the discursive or argued in the persuasive. A common mistake that students make is that they tend to say multiple things in one sentence, and I know Jaden probably saw this when I did the breakdown of that response, but it's called the double up problem, right? And you're going to say 2 things about what something means instead of just saying one thing in more depth. So a good strategy for all of you to use is to go through all of your essay drafts and look at wherever you have listed something, like you've done a comma and listed different things, or you've used the word and. So you've said, oh, this reveals this and this. Go back through and highlight every single time in your essay you've done that, and then get rid of one of those 2 things or get rid of the list and force yourself to say something more specific about one thing. I don't think you should memorize different thesis statements. I think have one base practice question that you think aligns well with your understanding of the text and module. So use one practice question to formulate your one draft essay that you're going to memorize. And then, Alison, the key thing for you to do is, and it sounds like the thesis statement is a sticking point there for you, which is very normal, and that can be it's a really important part of, I would just consider the introduction your thesis almost, right? That's a really central part of the criteria that the marker's going to use to decide whether you're a Band 6 student. How sophisticated is that breakdown? Now, what I would do is I would have the memorized thesis statement as part of your core draft, but then I would do lots of practice adapting that to different questions, and then you become naturally very flexible with it. But you'll find that for some questions, you can still use a lot of the elements that you had in the draft. It's not about rewriting it the exact same way, but it's about drawing upon the same ideas and elements that you already had in those original sentences. So my advice to you would be to still just stick with memorizing one, but then to go and look at 7 to 10 different questions, and you can look at all the past HSC questions, you can look at past papers, you can look online for other practice questions, and you can just sit down and practice writing a different thesis statement, or even I would say introduction as a whole. I would write a different introduction for every single one, but you've still got the base one memorized as your backup and as your source of sentence structures and how you're going to frame things, but you can deviate a lot from it. So practice makes perfect with thesis statement writing and unpacking the question, but I would still say memorize just the one key one. But after you practice a lot, by the time you get into the exam, you're probably going to remember a lot of the ways, at least, that you were able to adjust or approach different styles of questions. The other thing that everyone should be conscious of is that when you are doing different questions, when you're practicing adapting your essays to different questions, you want to make sure that you're looking at the different types. And there are 3 different types that I would focus on. So if you're taking notes, make sure you write this down. Go and do 3 examples. Go and find 3 different examples of questions that focus on a theme or an idea. That's the first type of question, a theme-based question. So the question asks you about how the text explores love or culture or identity, right? It's actually focusing on an idea. So make sure you've done 3 practice questions on that for each essay. The second common type, and it often links with the theme as well, is a form-based question. So that's the second type for you guys to practice, a form-based question. And here's a basic example of that. If you just wanted to practice, you would say, how does the text's form, or how does the form of the text allow the composer to represent and then insert a theme there? But the focus now is between the theme and the form. And the form is how the text has been represented as a whole. So we're talking about the dramatic form if it's a play. We're talking about the cinematic form if it's a film. You're talking about the fact that it's prose fiction novel if it's a novel. You're actually looking at those big macro techniques that constitute the text, not just the similes and the metaphors, right? They're not the aspects of form. We're looking at soliloquies because that's unique to dramatic form. You're looking at anything to do with the general makeup of the text, like the voice, the narration. A lot of people neglect narration in a novel. Who was the one speaking and from whose perspective? What are the limitations of that? What are the advantages of that? They're all aspects of form. So that's your form-based question. And the last one, and a lot of students fear this, they get scared of these questions, is a stimulus-based question or an excerpt-based question. So you actually get an extract from the text you've studied and you have to look at it, that little extract, and then you get a question after it. And you have to draw upon the extract, but then the question asks you about a particular theme or something more general. So you need to practice looking at questions that give you a statement or an extract from the text followed up by a direction to respond to that. We'll look at that as well closer to the end of today, but they're the 3 key types of questions that I would be looking at. And for anyone struggling with thesis statements, introductions generally, or just adapting to questions, I would focus on doing 3 examples from each of those. You don't need to write full essay responses when you're doing practice questions. Once you've memorized your core one, I would write this down. The 2 key things I would be practicing the most by far are the following because of time, right? You don't have, if you were to write out a full essay every time, it's a bit of a waste of time and it's chewing up a lot of your time that you could be spending on other things. You're going to get the best bang for your buck, right? You're going to get the best return on your investment in terms of time if you just focus on introductions and topic sentences. So get the introduction and the topic sentences that you've memorized, and then get those different types of questions that I just talked about and rewrite those 2 elements, your introduction in total and your topic sentences. They are going to give you the best return in that if you can nail those sections, the other ones are far easier, but the marker is going to be far more likely to give you a band 6 than if you nailed the analysis sentences. Rather than focusing on the sentences of analysis, focus on the conceptual sentences, the topic sentences where you introduce your points, and the introduction itself. The introduction is the first thing that your marker reads. So it just makes sense that you would focus on that. Here are the top 10 tips for you. They're all laid out here on this slide. We're actually going to go through each one, but in order, we're going to look at timing. We're going to look at how to progress your body paragraphs. We're going to look at how to progress your sentences within the paragraphs. We're going to talk about your actual sentences of analysis and how you construct those. And we'll look at that as a step-by-step process as well. So when you build a sentence of analysis, and if you're going back over your work, what are those core elements like the technique, the quote? What's the best way to use all of those together? And what else needs to be included in those sentences? Because a lot of students struggle to actually cover all of the elements in a concise way. So a lot of students will story tell. A lot of students, when they're trying to analyze something, are spending way too much time to communicate the one simple point they're trying to make. We're also going to talk about how to be more specific. How do you avoid listing and conjunctions? And we'll do some examples of that. Context, how do you integrate form and the macro elements so that you don't just have simple techniques, specific techniques like similes, metaphors, personification. If you feel that you've only got those kinds of techniques, then that will be helpful for you. How do you contextualize your quote in a concise way? How do you actually introduce the quote so that markers know where exactly you're talking about in the text? But you don't want to spend too long doing that. And you want to make your quotes flow into the sentence. I'm sure a lot of students on this recording now struggle with actually making the quote flow like a normal sentence. You probably have to put a comma before your quote, or you probably have to pause before you say it. We want to avoid that as much as we can. And then we want to look at the breakdown of new questions and build-in thesis statements to new questions. What's the quick way of thinking about a new question? Timing and strategy. All right, this is the number one thing for your overall preparation in addition to just preparing drafts for each one. We've talked about preparing and memorizing a core draft. But as you might have heard me say before, there's no point memorizing an essay that's too long. 32 up to 34. Now 34 minutes for Module A. For those doing advanced, you have to do a comparative study. That naturally is just a little bit longer. You need a little bit more time to cover all of the elements that are expected of you. So 34 minutes we can say for Mod A. 32 minutes is the ideal time for Common Module and Module B. Okay? Why is it 32 minutes and 34? You get 40 minutes on the day, at least for Module A and B, to complete the essay. So why are we saying 32 and 34 minutes? Because if you don't even know how long your essay takes to write, you've memorized this draft and you haven't actually sat down and written it out in timed conditions, even if you haven't memorized it yet, because you shouldn't memorize until you know how long it is, then you're going to go in that exam with complete uncertainty as to how long you actually have to work with. How much time can you stop and pause and think about the question? How much time do you have throughout to be making tweaks to those sentences? What a lot of students do who don't know how long that draft essay actually is they just feel like they have to regurgitate because they don't know the time they're working with. That's a fatal error. We need the 6 to 8 minute window to read the question, to deconstruct it, to mentally plan out where are those key changes if necessary. But mainly, we need to start writing soon after doing that quick analysis of the question and adapting each sentence so the wording is different. We want to make sure the wording of the sentence suits the question so that you actually mention the key terms of the question throughout, even if you're making the exact same point. Keep in mind that the first tip is timing for a reason, and that's because, if we look at this slide, have a look at the times down there. That's because there's no point even implementing any of the other changes if you run out of time in the exam. What's the point of improving all of this stuff if you're not going to have time to do it? So it's such a high level thing that you all need to be implementing. Common Mod, 32 minutes. Module A, 34 if you are doing a comparative for advanced, and 32 again for Module B. These are the ideals. You might not get it quite to that time, but get it as close as possible. Some of you might be very slow writers. You might want to push it a little bit, so maybe we'll say 34 minutes for you, but be really careful to do anything above that. I would say 34 is kind of pushing it, but I think if you're a slower writer, do 34 minutes because you obviously are just naturally disadvantaged because you can't write as much in that time. Usually someone would ask here, well, what's the word count I should aim for? And it's like, I can't tell you the word count because you all write at different speeds. It's whatever you can write in 32 to 34 minutes. That is the word count. Only you know the word count because you have to actually look at how many words your draft is, write it out, and you might find that, oh, that took me 42 minutes. Thank goodness I didn't memorize that because I would have not finished my exam and I would have jeopardized the other modules as well. As soon as you go over time in one, you're taking time away from another. So it's critical that you are honest about how fast or slow you are. You need to be very disciplined at cutting your essay down, cutting things out. Anything that's not essential needs to go. You need to spend a lot of time shortening your sentences. People take too long to communicate their point. If you're a slower writer, it will be different, but you should have, everyone, even if you're a slow writer, in each of your body paragraphs, you should have at least 3 pieces of analysis. So 3 different quotes, with 3 different techniques with 3 different explanations, different ideas connected, okay? So that's like a bare minimum. You've got to make sure you have that. But some of you might be sitting there with 5 pieces of analysis for one. And if you find that you're going way over time and your essay is actually 40 minutes instead of 32, well, straight away, okay, I can just cut down 2 pieces of those analysis, or in fact, I can just take them out as long as I've got at least 3. And I can actually probably deepen those ideas for those 3 instead of having 5 crammed in. So cutting down evidence to the point where you have at least 3 is one tactic. Another thing that a lot of students struggle with is they don't just do one topic sentence. Make sure you've only got one topic sentence followed by the first piece of analysis. You can bring context into these sentences of analysis, whereas some students try and have all these separate sentences at the beginning describing the context of the author or the contextual influences behind the text. So that's another mistake. So let's go over the 2 key things so far. Cut down evidence so you've got at least 3 pieces of analysis in each body paragraph. Second thing, make sure that after your one topic sentence at the top of each body paragraph, you go straight into your analysis, which can include and should include links to context. There's no need for a separate context sentence. So they're 2 practical ways to cut down the body paragraph. The other thing is try to minimize each sentence, or rather each piece of analysis, so they don't all take up 2 sentences. If you can get your whole point across in one sentence and it still flows, that's the ideal. So you would at least have 5 sentences for a body paragraph if you did everything we're saying here. Whereas I know after looking at a bunch of student responses that people will still only be doing 3 pieces of analysis, but yet they'll have like 10 sentences in that paragraph. Well, you could have had 5, one topic sentence, 3 pieces of analysis, and then the link sentence. So you can have at least 5. You might not quite get it down to 5 because you don't want to have a sentence that's super long and you have lots of commas. We don't want clunky sentences, but that's the art of going back through and refining and thinking, do I need that little bit? Do I need that chunk of the sentence? How can I say that in fewer words? That's the whole skill, right? Cutting things down. In terms of paragraphs generally, you should aim to have at least 3 body paragraphs in an essay. I would say for a 1 text essay, so your common module, module B, for everyone, even if you're standard or advanced, it's just 3 bodies. There's no need to have 4 bodies for that. 3 bodies is nice and simple. You're going to cover everything. 2 can be a little bit short, but if you're a very, very slow writer, you would then go for 2 body paragraphs with more evidence. You would have more than 3 pieces of evidence ideally. There's nothing we can really do if you're just a super, super slow writer. You just have to get faster because you're going to be capped at how well you can do if you're in that boat. But if you're a super slow writer but can still get 3 nice bodies, shorter body paragraphs, you can still do really well. You could still get full marks. It's just about being disciplined and about being honest about how much you can actually write. And the only way you can be honest about it is to actually know how long it takes you to write so many words. And that's why you all, after this workshop, the first thing I would be doing if you haven't done it is to sit down with a draft and time yourself writing it as fast as possible. Print out the draft for one of them and just write it as fast as you can looking at it. Don't memorize anything. Write it as fast as you can. Time it. Write the time at the bottom. It might be 10 minutes over what we're aiming for here, but that is going to save you a lot of marks. It's going to save you a lot of marks because by forcing yourself to cut the essay down and getting it as close as possible to the 32 to 34 minute range, you're going to ensure that you have time to not only adapt to the question on the day, but you're going to make sure you don't run out of time and then you have all these missing conclusions and you don't have the last paragraph there or you finished halfway. Or worst case, you didn't even have time to do module C because your other 2 essays were like double what they should have been. So this is about balancing out your time across the modules. The only way to do it is to stick to this timing strategy. Notice as well that despite you technically having 45 minutes in paper 1 for the short answers and the essay, I would still treat the common module essay as being 40 minutes, just in case you need an extra 5 minutes on section 1 where you do the short answers, because you haven't seen those before. That might throw you off, or you might need a little bit more time to think about it. So I would say pretend that the common module essay is only 40 minutes and pretend you have 50 minutes writing time for short answers plus 10 minutes reading time, which you should be spending on short answers. Don't do the common module essay first in paper 1. Do not do the essay first in paper 1. Always do the short answers, even if you don't like short answers, even if you feel way more confident with your essay, because you're going to then have to reread those texts, and they can take easily up to 10 minutes to get through. So make sure you do the short answers because you're going to be fresher on those unseen texts. It doesn't matter how much you like or dislike the essay question, do the essay second. In fact, make a note, do the whole paper in order. I've thought about this, obviously, for a long time, and I've played around with the idea of doing different structures. It just doesn't work. The actual exam structure makes the most sense for this one. In some exams, there are good reasons to do things out of order. I believe this is the best way to do it order-wise. Now, we're treating the common word essay as having 40 minutes. What about Module C? Module C, I would actually try and be able to do that in under 30 minutes. That's a bit different to the essays. I'm saying now go for under 30 minutes. Why am I allowing less time for Module C than the essays? What's different about a Module C response to an essay? When you write an imaginative, is that as structured? Do you need body paragraphs and a conclusion? You don't, right? So the craft of writing is more flexible in that it values quality over quantity. Whereas with the essay, you need to get through so much and you need to have a conclusion to satisfy the structural requirements. The conclusion only needs to be one sentence if you're running short on time. I would aim for 2 sentences, 2 short sentences for your conclusions. That's another place where you can save some words, right? But the essay needs to have a conclusion. You don't want to write an essay that doesn't then have a conclusion because you're running short on time. Whereas with craft of writing, the marker doesn't know how long your imaginative was meant to be. They wouldn't know if you had to cut some things out. So it's far more forgiving. The craft of writing is more forgiving and it values quality over quantity. So you can have a much shorter composition and still get full marks. The reflection, of course, is more structured. So practice doing that in a short amount of time. But I feel like the composition doesn't need to be nearly as long as the equivalent of an essay. Especially if you're preparing for like a 10 or 12 mark composition, then it's way less, of course. But even assuming you got a 20 mark imaginative response, the word count of that should be far less and can be far less than the essay. Okay, because it's more about quality than quantity and structure there. Very, very unlikely that you're going to get a reflection that's worth more than 8 to 10 marks. You probably haven't seen an example of that other than an internal assessment. So on the day of the exam, it's a maximum of 20 marks. It's at least going to be 10 marks for the composition aspect. And then you have that possible 10 marks on the reflection. But what I'm saying is the composition that's 10 marks, that should be less than half the length of an essay. Less than half the length of the essay, because it would only have been 10 marks, but it doesn't need to be the equivalent of half of one essay. It can be less. So you save time there. The reflection, you're not going to save as much time because it's still written more like an essay. It would still have a very short introduction, 1 to 2 sentences, 2 short body paragraphs, and a 1-sentence conclusion would be the reflection. So you can save time on the composition aspect of the craft of writing, not so much on the reflection. Make sure you have this week, I would actually say by tomorrow, sat down and at least timed one of your essays so that you have a reference point for how long and how fast you can write. Like how long will it take you to write an 800-word essay? It doesn't matter how many words you have, but say it's 800 words. Oh, 800 words takes me 40 minutes. Okay, well that's too long. Your essays can't be 800 words. Your essay will have to be maybe 700 words or a bit less. And you'll have to practice getting faster at writing as well. The faster you are, the more advantaged you are, because the more you can write in 32 to 34 minutes. But I want you all to sit down by tomorrow, at least with one of the essays, because then you can look at your other essays and say, well, I know in that essay, 800 words equaled 40 minutes, so you can use that as a reference point for the others. But you should, in the next week, time all of them in any case, because they might be slightly different. And it's good practice as well for the speed of your handwriting. It's not so much about figuring out what elements should be cut and what shouldn't. It's just a matter of saying, how can I say all of this in less words? That's the first ideal, right? Because then you don't have to get rid of essential things. You're just shortening the way you do it. A lot of people use far too many words and sentences to say the main point. So I'm suggesting that you go through first of all and say, look, oh, I've got this second kind of topic sentence that is covering context. Well, I'm not saying to get rid of context. I'm saying maybe you can just weave that in with the rest of your analysis. Maybe that doesn't need to be a full sentence. Maybe that can be a little clause at the start of the first sentence of analysis. Let's get rid of all my references to context. Definitely don't do that. I'm saying, how can you talk about context in less words? A conclusion, for instance, only needs to be 2 sentences. So you might be thinking, well, what am I cutting out? Well, I would suggest that if you have a 4-sentence conclusion, you could probably cover all of that in 2 sentences. It's just the process of going through it and practicing writing something in different ways so that you can do it in less words. If you're talking about an introduction, I would need to see it. I would say 4 sentences for an introduction is plenty. Anything less than 3 is not enough, but I would aim for 4 sentences for an introduction. As I said, you could do a body paragraph in as little as 5 sentences. If you're only doing 3 body paragraphs, you would ideally aim for 4 sentences of analysis, but if you're a slower writer, at least 3. So I'm just kind of giving you some guides of how many sentences. Yes, it is a matter of judgment when you say, well, I've got 4 pieces or 5 pieces of analysis, I need to cut it down to 3. In that case, I would focus on which points are the best, which points work best together and have the most unique ideas, but they still link together. Because you might have 2 pieces of analysis that are basically saying the same thing. They're different quotes, different techniques, but they're making a similar point. So Anna, there's a thing there. You can go through and you can say, oh, where have I ever said like similarly, or where have I ever said reinforces, or where have I ever said further? Because those things are probably just being repetitive. So cut out all the pieces of analysis that are repeating other points and prioritize points that are genuinely different and that are moving your argument forward. But anything that seems a bit repetitive with respect to another point, just cut those out. Thesis statement is the kind of overarching argument you're going to make, but you've got to break down the words of the question in that sentence. So you're using the words of the question to make your overall argument, and then the next few sentences are where you introduce the 3 body paragraph points, but don't repeat your topic sentences there, whilst also referencing the overarching plot even, referencing context, referencing form. You're introducing the core elements and contextual influences whilst giving us an idea of how your argument is going to progress. So you're basically drawing upon the 3 body paragraph ideas that can inform how you go about that. You might have a sentence that then talks about the overall value of the text for readers over time. Like, why does it have enduring value? That's especially the case for Module B. For Module A, you might have a last sentence that talks about the value of studying the text together. That's a good idea. So Module A with a comparative study probably doesn't quite follow that same structure, but it would have a thesis that unpacks it. It would introduce each text and the core ideas and how they're different. And then it would say, well, what is the value of studying the 2 texts together? That would be like the Module A 4-sentence. Now, progression between body paragraphs. This is the second tip here, okay? We won't spend as long on this one, but something that a lot of students struggle with is actually differentiating between their ideas. Are you in that position where you have an essay, but there's no real reason for why the first body paragraph comes first? Why does the second paragraph go second? Do you simply just have 3 different themes that you're exploring and you've just put them in a random order? Or is there a good reason for the way that you've structured your argument? And that's why I would recommend all of you go back over your draft essays and isolate the topic sentences. So get your 3 topic sentences, for example, assuming you have a 3 body paragraph structure. Get the 3 topic sentences and stack them on top of one another and read them out and see, is there a sequence there? Are you genuinely moving the argument forward? When I draft an essay, the very first thing I do is the topic sentences. It's not the introduction. Why would I draft an introduction when I don't even know what I'm introducing? In fact, when I draft an essay, the last thing I do is the introduction. Which sounds funny because you're probably thinking, but in the exam, Are you saying that we don't write the introduction first? No, in the exam you do, because you've already done all the preparation. When you're drafting an essay for the first time in preparation, that's when I don't look at the introduction to start with, because I want to figure out what are my core arguments, what are the 3 points I'm making, and why are they in that order. And it's a very helpful tool that usually works for every text, is to make sure that the first idea matches up to the first part of the text. So a lot of my evidence for my first body paragraph would actually come from the beginning of the text. My second paragraph would probably be focused on the idea that comes out in the middle. And my last body paragraph is going to be focused on the ending. How does it end? And it's usually to do with some kind of resolution. The first body paragraph is usually establishing some kind of struggle, some kind of conflict, some problem that the characters are facing. The middle of the text is usually showing how they've responded or what have been the consequences of that problem. So follow a structure like that. Base your evidence on the different parts, the 3 different sections of the text, the beginning, the middle, and the end. Poetry is a little bit different. You would obviously just have to sequence that in terms of ideas that make sense going from one to another to show different perspectives. But that's the only real exception there. If you're doing anything other than poetry, in which case, again, you would just go poem A, poem B, poem C, and you would choose an appropriate order based on the ideas that are coming out. Try and work from a problem towards a potential solution. A negative towards a positive. Negative, bad things to good things is a good way of structuring any kind of essay. And it might not be good things at the end. It might not be positive, but you're working towards the question or the possibility of something good happening, even if it doesn't happen in the text. Like you may have done a text like 1984 or The Crucible where there's a really tragic ending, but nonetheless, it's at least giving us hope potentially of what it takes, or it's giving us a sense of urgency to respond to the text so that we avoid that potential catastrophe, whatever it is. Okay, so we need to make sure the body paragraphs are moving forward, and I've just told you an example of how you might want to restructure your evidence. Make sure your quotes are not just random. Who has quotes and you don't really know where they have come from in the text? Like, you know they're a good quote, but they're not ordered, and you wouldn't know like the chapters or the sections that they've come from. Just show of hands there. Okay, so there's a lot of us in that boat, right? It is definitely worth going back, and it won't take that much time. Just think about where those quotes actually came from. And I'm not saying you have to match up the quotes with exactly where they were in the text and then they have to go in that order, but it's a good default. It's a good thing to do as a starting point. And then if you choose to use a quote from later in the text earlier, at least have a good reason for that. Because it wouldn't make sense to have a quote from the end of the text right at the beginning, and you might have done that without knowing, when actually the context of that quote was something completely different to what you have associated with. So don't associate quotes that had a different context with a prior idea that doesn't fit with it. So make sure you know where the quotes are coming from in the text, and think about reordering it. A lot of you are probably in a position where you would benefit from just restructuring it. I'm not saying you need to go and find completely new evidence. I'm saying think about how you've ordered it all together. Now, that's how you can improve the progression of your topic sentences. Once again, a very useful tactic for your body paragraphs is to go through the order of the text and find an idea that matches up with each section, the beginning, the middle, and the end. You'll find that it follows this kind of structure for 3 body paragraphs. The first body paragraph should be establishing a tension, a conflict, a problem. As you know, that's what happens at the beginning of a text. There's usually a complication. What is that complication in the text? Start with that and break that down in that body paragraph. Okay, next thing. What is the response to that problem? What does the protagonist or the persona go on to do? What do they struggle doing it, and why? What are the consequences of that problem? That's what you can explore in the middle one. And then the last one is there a resolution? How is this problem resolved, if at all? Maybe the problem isn't resolved and you need to explain why. Again, that might be to create urgency. It might be to frighten the reader that there is no positive outcome unless you do something about it. 1984 in mind, and things like that. But often in a text, there is some kind of resolution. Even in the Crucible, the protagonist ends up dead, but he stood up for the truth. So he sacrificed himself. So there was an act of heroism, and you could say that that is there to inspire the audience. So how does the text end, and what's the core concept associated with that? Make sure you're not storytelling and just saying, oh, the novel ends this way. You don't say it like that. I'm saying you should think about the ending and then say the idea. But it shouldn't be obvious that you're saying at the ending of the novel, like at the end of the novel. Don't word it that way. That's just how you should approach it. Or could approach it. Again, it's one approach. There's many approaches. I believe there's an example on here. I mean, if you're doing module A and you're doing 2 texts, you probably want to split. If you're doing 4 body paragraphs, 4 bodies, you probably want to think about it in 2 halves. So 2 key ideas, and then how is that idea explored in each one? Here's an example of language that will help you do it. And one of the key takeaways here is that the way you actually word your topic sentences can be really helpful for forcing you to do the right thing. Now, don't worry if you're not doing Shakespeare and Atwood. Don't worry about the actual text here. Have a look at the wording that forces you to structure your topic sentences in a progressive way, so that your argument actually goes forward and it's not going sideways or backwards. What word do you guys think is important in the first topic sentence there? That's an example of 2 topic sentences. In the first one, what's the key word that makes it clear that this is the beginning, this is the first paragraph? To instigate something is to begin something. Instigate, you started it. You know, who instigated the fight means who started it. Shakespeare starts the textual conversation by doing this, by exposing this idea. The language there makes it clear that that's your first topic sentence. Very subtle, but you guys can work on using words like that. This one, instigates, might only be relevant for a module A textual conversation one, but it's the principle of using words that make it clear where you are. The second body paragraph, what are the key words there that signal that this is directly following the first body paragraph? So what you're looking at where it says Atwood responds to this Jacobian representation, that's the second topic sentence. What makes it clear that that's the second topic sentence? Responds to this. Okay? Responds to this. Atwood responds. She's responding to that first one. And the other key word is this. This is really good because it's saying this representation, meaning it's referring back to what was just said in the first body paragraph. Here's an example from a common module essay. In this case, it's on the Crucible. Look, it doesn't matter if you're not doing the Crucible, but have a look at how the problem, consequence, and resolution is formatted here, because everyone can use a similar structure to this. Everyone can use a similar structure to what you're seeing on the screen. What word makes it clear that the first topic sentence, and by the way, these are 3 topic sentences. They haven't all been filled out, of course, because I'm just showing you how to frame it. And there's that fill in the blank aspect. But what word in the first topic sentence, Miller exposes the tension between moral integrity and the fear of social alienation when power might be exploited or something. Now, what word there indicates that that is clearly to do with the problem at the beginning of the play? So you've got exposes the tension. That's a nice phrase because the tension means that there is a problem, that there is a conflict. You don't have to use the word problem, and you shouldn't really use the word problem. That's just to help you guys think about it. But exposes the tension or exposes the conflict between. Telling us what the conflict's between is going to be a really useful way of breaking down that first point, that first topic sentence. What about the second body paragraph? What are we starting the second topic sentence with that's very obvious, that is clearly going to talk about the impact of the problem? Consequently. By using consequently, it forces you to do the right thing. Why does consequently force you to do the right thing in terms of the paragraph progression? Forces you to talk about a consequence. By saying consequently, you are literally forcing yourself to say what one consequence is, a big consequence is, of that initial conflict. Cause was the problem, the effect is there in the second body, and then the ultimate resolution, nonetheless, Miller suggests this, you're now saying, well, look, this is how it kind of ends. And this is the idea that's introduced at the end. Again, don't say the word ends and in the middle of the text and at the beginning. Don't say it like that. But this is basically all framed in connection with those different parts of the text. So consequently, this pursuit of power. Have a look back at the second topic sentence. Can everyone see how it says, not just consequently, this? The word this is really powerful. So everyone should be writing that down for you to try and use in your own topic sentences to link back to the point you just made. This pursuit of power, and then tell me what the consequence is. By looking at your topic sentences in this way, you're going to improve the sophistication of your argument and the structure. Remember, when you go back through your drafts, one key tip that I would suggest you all follow is to write down the 3 topic sentences just like you see here, in full. I know here they're not all filled out. Write down your 3 topic sentences for each essay, back to back like this, and make sure there is a progression. You don't have to do it in this exact way, but make sure the ideas are moving forward. And then go and re-select or reorder your evidence accordingly to make sure they all match up to that idea. So don't be afraid to restructure your essays completely in the next week or so, but certainly in the next 2 weeks, you want to get this all finalized so that you have that 2-week period to memorize everything. The third tip here is to make sure you've got a progression between your sentences. Think about how we just talked about having a progression between the topic sentences, which represents the first sentence of each paragraph. But now if we zoom in on a particular paragraph, the evidence effects there, as you know, there is teal, peel, pedal. We're talking about the inside of the paragraph where you have all of that analysis. And you might remember me saying you should have at least 3 pieces of analysis in an essay, ideally 4 if you're doing a 3-body paragraph structure, but you have to be honest about how fast you can write and respect that time limitation. But we need to make sure we're not repeating the same point. I would recommend you all go back through and read your 3 to 4 sentences of analysis and ensure that the points you're making there are genuinely moving forward, that you're not repeating. A lot of students will get a similar point and a different quote and technique and think that that's enough. Oh, I'm just going to provide 3 examples of the exact same thing. No, we need 3 different examples that all show a slightly different point, which all fit under the topic sentence idea. Okay, so that's not an easy thing to do, but you can use a similar way of thinking that we just talked about with the actual topic sentences. So just in the way that the topic sentences should link together, as I'm showing you now, that is how the evidence effect sentences within the body should be flowing. Another thing I want you all to do with your essays is to go back and revisit your analysis. So say you've got your topic sentences down, they're progressing nicely. Now you think that you know how to progress your evidence as well. Like I'm going to make this point, then I'm going to make this point, then I'm going to make this point. Great. How are you actually writing the sentence of analysis? So you get a quote, you get a technique. Don't be afraid to go back to basics if you feel like the sentence or sentences for your analysis are too long. They're too verbose. And verbose means you're using too many words to convey the point. Don't be afraid to simplify it and go back to basics. I always start with a basic approach, okay? The basic approach is to have a technique, a quote, a verb such as reveals, and an effect where you explain the impact or the meaning behind that evidence. Okay? That's the starting point. I'm not saying that that's enough. I'm not saying that that's the final sentence of analysis, because there are 1 or 2 other things, 2 other steps really, to improve that to that band 6 level. But the first thing you need to do, and this is a really useful tip, does anyone feel like they story tell at times? Like they're describing what happens, but they're not analyzing what happens. If you feel like you are describing or you've been told that by your teacher, here's the easiest thing you can do to stop doing that. Start with the technique at the start of the sentence, okay? I could bet that if you're having that problem, you don't always start with the technique at the start, because that means if you do lead with the technique, that you're then forced to provide the quote where that technique was present and explain its effect. Whereas if you don't lead with the technique, you might start kind of waffling on. You might go on a little rant and, oh, this happens, then this happens. Oh, this is exemplified by this. Whereas if you just go, the metaphor in this reveals this, you're analyzing, you're in an analytical mindset and framework. So the best fix I can recommend for you is to go through all of the sentences of analysis you currently have and rework them so the evidence comes first. Now, of course, the counter argument to that is to say, well, isn't that going to get really repetitive? Well, yes, I'm not suggesting to do it as the final product for every sentence. I'm saying it's a starting point. And you can also change how you start the sentence. So the technique, everyone just like write down an example. Everyone must have a technique on hand that they know they've used in an essay. Just literally write down now the, THE, as you see in the diagram here, the metaphor, the personification, the simile, the whatever type of repetition, imagery, something, a technique that you know you've used. Write that down now. That. That's how simple it can be to get into the analysis. But it's very easy to overcomplicate it if you start by trying to describe things that happened. I'm not saying we won't include some references to things that happened. Again, it's a starting point. What are some other ways you can do it? Write down these other expressions to mix it up if you're not sure about them. So instead of just saying the metaphor, we can also say through the metaphor. Through the metaphor, comma, the composer illustrates this. So there'd have to be a comma if you do through the. Through the metaphor in this quote, comma. Just make sure if you're going to write through the technique, you have a comma after the quote. You can also say the, or instead of the, you can say the composer's name and say, I'm going to use Shakespeare as an example. Shakespeare's use of a metaphor in this reveals this. Everyone following? So there's like 3 different sentence starters that will give you a little bit of variation. But the idea here is to lead with the technique. The technique here could be a simple specific technique. We'll talk about having more sophisticated techniques, those macro techniques, worked into the sentence as well. That's the basic structure we're going to be using. And here's an example. What technique can we see in this quote? He was a shell of himself. Okay, so this is imagine that's an extract from a novel. He was a shell of himself, and it's describing a person. Say it's describing a soldier coming back from war. It is a metaphor. So I'm just going to go through this to show an example. You've got your quote. You know that the quote links to the idea that you want to talk about in that paragraph. Oh, he was a shell of himself. I want to talk about the destructive effects of war. Let's say this was about war and it was a soldier. And it talked about a guy who came back from war. And it says, oh, he was a shell of himself. And it's characterizing this soldier. So we want to say the metaphor, again, just the starting point, you will end up with something different. The metaphor in he was a shell of himself reveals, and then we want to say something specific. Why would someone use that expression? You're a shell of yourself. When someone calls themselves a shell, they're saying you don't have the substance inside. So you've been emptied out. Richie says you've become empty. You adjust your physical body. Basically, you've lost your essence. It would mean that if you were to see that person, they have like lost that joy and that soul. It's like they've been traumatized, perhaps. What else would it say about your motivation and your morale? What would you say about it? That it's been what? It's been lost. It's been depleted. What we're going through here is an analysis of what this quote actually means. The more specific you can be about the effect of this, the higher band you're going to be in, right? You want to be band 6, you need to provide a specific thing that clearly relates to shell. Now, if we're calling someone a shell, we want to try and use a word associated with shell. The associated word was empty, because when you think of a shell, it's empty inside, isn't it? Notice how we've drawn a connection there, and then we're going to try and use that in the explanation. It reveals the extent to which the protagonist, assuming it's the main character, the protagonist's morale has been depleted. And have a look at this. Shell and depleted are similar in that a shell doesn't have anything inside, so it's been emptied out. If you deplete, you've run out of something. Can everyone see the connection between the word of the quote and the word we used in the explanation? The idea there is that the word you're using has something directly relevant to the key word of the quote. A lot of students do generic explanations of the quote. The way to avoid it, this is just one simple, very practical tip, is to find a word in the quote you've looked at and think of a synonym or a related term and use that in the explanation. Because you can't use the exact same word, can you? You wouldn't say he was a shell of himself, reveals the extent to which the protagonist became a shell of himself. But you can say something along those lines in different terms, and that shows the marker that you're interpreting the quote in a specific way. So all of those points earlier about how to be more specific, this is a really good one. Make sure you use a word in the explanation, in the same sentence, that will link directly to a key part of the quote, or maybe it links directly to the technique. How do you be more sophisticated in your writing? Well, you want to avoid listing and conjunctions. Listing and conjunctions, right? Remember I talked about it earlier, how you probably are trying to say too many things. You're doubling up. You're using multiple words rather than going deeper on the one term, the one idea. Here's an example. Anyone feel like they do anything like this? Have a read through these. Does anyone have any part of their essay that might read like with all these commas? Shakespeare explores power, manipulation, and control. Shakespeare explores power and corruption. Shakespeare explores power and manipulation. Does anyone do anything like that where they often say something and something because they feel like they're saying more by doing that? A lot of us, right? It's one of the most common problems I've seen in writing. I would suggest that all of you here, without knowing any of you, without maybe have seen any of your work, I would know that all of you would have some aspects of your essay that do a little bit of this. They're trying to say more. You're trying to say more. You're trying to convince yourself that you're doing more by using very similar words bundled up next to each other, because it makes the sentence a bit longer, of course. And it seems like you're saying all of these different ideas, but it doesn't tell us anything specifically about any of the ideas. Like Shakespeare explores power, manipulation, and corruption. Okay, I get a sense of like 3 very similar words, but I don't know anything about any of them. Did you see that? It doesn't actually tell us anything. So we need to make sure that we're not doing sentences like this even. So what we want to do is we remove manipulation, control. We remove all the similar words, and then you expose what you're actually saying. So can you guys see how if a student wrote the first sentence here, Shakespeare explores power, manipulation, and corruption, isn't that the exact same level of depth essentially as saying Shakespeare explores power? Like you've just added 2 other words that are very similar. So they're all on the same level of generality. They're all superficial. None of them are saying anything specific. That tells us nothing. You may as well just have said Shakespeare explores power, but students convince themselves that they're saying more. You see that? It's a little trick you can play on yourself. The first step is just to ask yourself different questions. You're kind of going into answering those specific ones already, but I'm saying the first thing to do is to say, what are some questions I can ask in relation to power? So instead of saying Shakespeare explores power, what's a question I can ask? What type of power? What's another question? That's the what type question. Now that works. We can say the type of power. What else? Who is a good question? What's another one? Why are they using it? Why is power being exercised? But the other general question, it's similar to what type. It's just what, and then you can add like whatever appropriate. So what about power? Like he's exploring what about power? Like, okay, what type of power? How is power being explored? How is a great question. What type isn't always enough. Shakespeare explores institutionalized power. That's not actually giving me an insight. Make sure we're not missing the key point of give me a specific idea. So do you see the difference there between Shakespeare explores power, Shakespeare explores institutionalized power, and Shakespeare explores the way in which institutionalized power can lead to X. Do you see how that is an insight? So everyone should note down this phrase you're going to see on the next one. This is a simple example. I've tried to keep it simple. Shakespeare explores the ability for, the capacity of. These are fantastic expressions to use that will force you to provide a specific insight about something, okay? So Shakespeare explores the ability for power to corrupt. Does everyone agree that Shakespeare explores the ability for power to corrupt is one level better than Shakespeare explores power, manipulation, and corruption? See the difference? That one even has more words potentially. Maybe it's the same amount of words. It seems like it might be saying more, but actually it's saying nothing, as we said. this is at least giving us an insight. So the expression, the ability for, is a really good one. But as Anna pointed out, we still haven't said what. We haven't said what type of power. We haven't said who it corrupts. Notice how you can keep asking these questions to go a little bit deeper when you're drafting. We can also avoid saying how power corrupts. Does anyone find you might have to do a search of your own document to know if you do this, but have a look at how many times you say how. Shakespeare explores how power corrupts. Does anyone feel like they would naturally say that, the word how? Yeah, instead of saying how, try and say the ability for, the extent to which. These are phrases I would write down because how is a little bit less sophisticated. It just sounds better if you can say the ability for or the extent to which. So write those two phrases down because I think they're far better than saying how. And you can do a Control F or Command F on your documents where you have the drafts, and I'm sure you will, or if you got handwritten, you can read through and highlight. I think once you've gone 1 to 2 layers deeper, that's enough. So if you've answered a couple of those questions, like what type, and you've provided an insight like I've shown you here, it should be it'll become intuitive and natural to you when it's enough. The point is to basically be able to read the sentence and say, have I said that in a specific way? Have I actually said something meaningful? And like here we kind of have, but then you might be like, oh, I haven't been specific as to like who generally or how it corrupts, etc. So I would probably say one level deeper than this, if that gives you a kind of reference point. Right now, it's not as specific as it could be. So have a look at the final one. Because we haven't said what it's corrupting, right? Shakespeare explores the ability for political power, totalitarian, moral, social, power, to corrupt an individual's moral integrity. That's the line where I would stop there, Anna, if that answers your question. At the point where you can see what's being corrupted, what type of power, those questions are kind of answered. What we're talking about here is just like the introductory kind of sentences. And by the way, you don't have to go through every single sentence and ask what type, and keep doing it. But it is a really useful thing to do when you're trying to unpack a question for an essay, is to keep asking it and answer it with different ones. You don't want to just keep saying political power the whole way through your essay. So you want to answer these questions in different ways depending on where you're at in your essay and who and what you're talking about. Remember, we looked at our basic sentences of analysis as requiring a technique, quote, verb, and then you've got to explain it. And we looked at how when you explain it, you should do what? It's synonyms plus related terms that a marker would reasonably be able to draw a connection between, okay? So this is about context. Who feels like they don't mention enough context in their essays, like historical context, the values of the time, the personal motivations of the author? Who thinks they don't have enough of it? You might not know if you have enough of it because I haven't told you how much you should have. Each body paragraph you have in all of your essays, especially Module A for advanced, you should have 2 references to context per paragraph. And a reference to context can look like what you're seeing on the screen. Who feels like they currently have at least 2 of those kind of references to context in every single paragraph of all of their draft essays? No. Okay, so there's something for all of you to work on. What do you notice about the way that this sentence, imagine you have a sentence of analysis. Remember the example I showed you before? It didn't reference any context, did it? But now, if we add a clause at the start, this will help all of you. If you add a clause at the start of the sentence, a clause isn't a sentence. A clause is a part of a sentence that is followed by a comma or a semicolon or a dash, right? It's part of a sentence, but it's separated by some kind of punctuation. So that's what I mean when I say the word clause. Now, what do you notice about the way this talks about context? Can someone observe what's happening there? It says reflecting, which is a great way to bring in context, so everyone should write that down. A lot of students struggle to know how to start sentences. Well, here you go. Use the word reflect in thee, and then say something specific about context. But can someone tell me what you think is good about the way that this brings in context? This is in relation to some, Shakespeare text, for example. It doesn't just say reflect in the Jacobean era, but that might not be obvious at first because I'm showing you the full thing. What it does say though is a specific value. So make sure you specify the value of the context, because often people use these generic terms for the era. They say, oh, the Jacobean era, or the Elizabethan era, or contemporary society, 21st century audience. They say terms like that to refer to some kind of context, but they haven't said the value. They haven't said the actual thing about it that's relevant. So notice how this actually says, well, this one says the patriarchal values. This is what a lot of students do. And so you understand, this is a low band 5 quality. What I'm showing you here, reflecting the Jacobian era. That's low band 5, low 80s. Okay? Just so everyone gets a feel of where that's at. That's like an 85 standard if you do everything else right. Reflecting the Jacobian era. You want to pump it up to a band 6? Look at the bottom one. Now you can see the difference. Everyone should be taking a note of how you can do that. You just slot in the value, the specific value of the context, and suddenly that specificity ups the sophistication, and now you're in the band 6 level. I'll say the first one is probably a mid-band 5. You'd be lucky to get anywhere in the band 5s if you didn't refer to context at all. I mean, at least that's referring to context, saying reflecting the era, but it's not saying what it's reflecting about the era, so it just doesn't have that specific insight offered, whereas the other one does. Macro and micro. What do I mean by that? I mean, when you talk about, you know how before we were talking about the metaphor? That is a micro technique. That's a small technique. Okay, that's a specific technique. An acronym I've been enjoying lately is basically to split your analysis between macro features and micro features. Macro, have I used something that is a bigger technique versus the micro, the small technique of a metaphor? Have I combined both of them together at times? You don't have to do this every single time, but in majority of sentences, so let's say at least 2 sentences of analysis per paragraph, there's your rule to write down, at least twice, have I mentioned the form or like a soliloquy or the narration style, like who's speaking? Is it first person narration or third person narration? These are all aspects, these are biggies, right? These are the bigs. The smalls are those specific ones. Try and blend them together at times, and I've given you an example of how you can do that with the opening clause of the sentence. Can someone tell me what the start of that sentence might have looked like if you didn't do the specific thing? Someone just tell me what you think it would look like. Here it says facilitated, which means helped by, it's a good phrase to use, helped by the visceral impact of the dramatic form. Then you go into this more specific analysis that we looked at before, like the metaphor in he was a shell of himself, da-da-da-da-da. Facilitated by the visceral impact. Visceral means you feel it, because when you watch a play, this is dramatic form, so we're talking about if you were studying a play. If you were looking at a play live in an audience, it's probably going to be quite confronting, and you're probably going to feel it more in your body because you're actually there. So that's what visceral means, by the way, so I don't want to confuse people or lose people on the words here. Facilitated by the dramatic form, or what's better? Facilitated by the visceral impact of the dramatic form. Can everyone see that minor extension? Now, I'm going to quickly go through the last 3 here. So the other things you want to make sure you're doing is you don't want to just give quotes without telling the marker where you're referring to in the text. So it's always good, and I would write this down, to make sure you say who are you talking about in terms of the quote? Who is being talked about? Because that's a very easy thing to add in. Who is speaking might be a relevant one. And the other one that is helpful is what was generally happening. What was the relevant event? But you've got to be careful that you don't story tell. So it's very, very brief. It's a subtle reference to what was happening. It might be a few extra words at the end of the sentence. So let's have a look at that. Where do you see it here? Tony's use of a metaphor, well, that's the character who actually said it in the story. See how that's different to saying the? Now we know who said it. Tony's use of a metaphor when describing Brett, another character, upon his return from war. He was a shell of himself, reveals the extent to which, it should say just Brett's morale there, had depleted. So can you all see there that the marker knows more about what you're talking about versus before when it just says the metaphor in this reveals this? You've got to mention the characters, of course, who are relevant and roughly what's happening. Now, is this the cleanest way of introducing this quote? No, because it doesn't flow, does it? See how there's a comma? And I mentioned before that most people will have commas, then they have the quote. But how do we make it flow into the sentence so that if I were to remove the quotation marks, it would still flow like a normal sentence? Who struggles to do that? Who struggles to make their sentence flow like a normal sentence? with the quotes? I would think it would be everyone. So just testing here who's still engaged in this. Okay, it's a lot of people because it's very hard to do. Well, I shouldn't say it's very hard to do. It's hard to do if you don't know what to look for. Put it that way. It's actually not that hard to do if you approach it the right way. So we're going to come to how to actually make it integrate. One of the key tips, of course, to do that is to make your quote as short as possible. Because if you can shorten your quotes, a lot of people use quotes that are way too long. First of all, that's taking away time from your analysis, which is way more important. And it's also going to make it harder for you to make that long quote work into the rest of the sentence. If you want to make a long quote work into the rest of the sentence, you're going to have to be very, very diligent and strategic about how you do that. Whereas if it's a shorter quote, it's probably far more flexible. So shorter quotes are far more adaptable to a sentence, and you'll be able to more easily flow through the quote into the rest of the sentence if you do that. So shorten your quotes. What you can do with your quotes though, is you can break them up and use them at different sections of the sentence. That's a more sophisticated way of doing it. That's called embedding your quotes into the sentence naturally so that you don't have this one distinct long quote. Instead, you've chopped it up and worked it into your sentence. So it all flows, but on multiple occasions, you're referring to a quotation. Maybe you're referring to two different quotations that kind of fit together nicely into the sentence. That's the most advanced level of using quotes. Okay, so does everyone see on the slide here, this example? So we had the original one where it's a little bit clunky, right? We had the comma. Now look at how we've reworked it. Tony's use of a metaphor when describing Brett as a shell of himself reveals the extent to which Brett's morale had depleted after returning from war. What have we done to the quote to make this flow? So instead of saying he was, notice how he was, is that really an important part of the quote? He was? No. The important part is that he's a shell of himself. So cut it down to its bare minimum, right? And then it's more adaptable because then it was easy to say, oh, Tony's use of a metaphor when describing Brett as. The word as before the quote was really important. So make sure you are looking at what word have you used right before the quote. That's just as important for ensuring the flow. It's not just going to automatically happen if you shorten the quote. You've got to shorten the quote plus set up the sentence in the right way so that it flows in directly before and then it then continues on after. But now if I read this sentence out, Tony's use of a metaphor when describing Brett as a shell of himself, see how I didn't have to stop to say the quote? I didn't have to pause with a comma. That's a nice flow. So that's what you want to achieve with all of your quotes as best as possible. Sometimes it might be tricky to do it. I'm not saying you have to do it 100% of the time to get a band 6. I'm just saying this is something you can try and improve throughout wherever possible. Here is another way of removing the returning from war aspect. We can change that to the end. So Tony's use of a metaphor when observing that Brett was a shell of himself. Notice how we've substituted he for Brett, but I put it in square brackets. Why have I put it in square brackets? Did we need to even keep it in this quote? Not really. We could actually take it out and say, when observing that Brett, quote, was a shell of himself. Do you see how you can manipulate, you can cut bits out from the quote, add some extra words before, but if you change the original quote to something else and it's in the quotation marks, you need to represent that new word with a square bracket on either side. So that tells the marker that wasn't originally in the quote. That's when you use square brackets. Okay, and then it says, reveals the extent to which Brett's morale had depleted after returning from war. See the little bit of extra context that we just added? 4 words after returning from war. 4 words, but now I know what you're referring to in the text. So that's what we mean by contextualizing the quote as well. Okay, the last tip, the last trick that I want to go over is the question adaptation. But we've covered a lot of how you unpack an essay question. So when you get a new essay question on the day and when you do your practice, I'll go through how to approach it. But again, we've covered kind of how to break them down. You need to identify the key terms and you need to ask yourself those mini questions. What type? What? What about? How? Why? So what? If you ask yourself a few of those questions, a couple of them are going to allow you to expand. And that means that even though you should be using the actual key terms of the question and not synonyms, do not use synonyms in your essays, you're going to elaborate on them so that you're not merely repeating the question. Okay? So that trick of asking yourself mini questions in relation to the key terms of the question. What type? How, why, so what? Everyone should write down those questions. Identify the key terms of the question and then ask what type, how, why, so what? That is going to give you an immediate strategy to use to elaborate. Force yourself to say something specific and meaningful about the question. The first question though is, how much do you need to adapt your essays? You're probably wondering, how much do I have to adapt it? Well, here's a useful diagram. The color code in here represents the level of adaptation required. An introduction, topic sentences, and links require maximum adaptation. It doesn't mean that you can't reuse and recycle the draft material that you've memorized. In fact, you probably will stick with the exact same structure and argument fundamentally. But what it means is you need to have lots of the actual key terms of the question in those sentences. In your introduction, your topic sentence, link sentence, and conclusion as well. You need to be using the key terms of the question a lot. In my introduction, I would try to use at least one or two key terms of the question in every single sentence. It has to be excessive. If you can practice using the key terms of the question in every single sentence of your introduction, not repeating them, using them in a meaningful way that links to what you already wanted to say, then you are going to be in a very good position for that band 6 criteria, especially when it comes to answering the question. How well did this student answer the question? Well, they used the key terms 9 times in the introduction and in a meaningful way, and it's well structured. How could that not be band 6? You want to be in a band 6, you want to be in the marker's mind at a band 6 level once they've finished reading your introduction. If you write a sentence in your introduction that doesn't reference directly an actual key term of the question, I'm not talking about synonyms, do not use synonyms. I'm talking about using the actual key terms of the question. The marker's going to start thinking you're not answering that question, which is exactly what's happening. You're not. So introduction is the most key. Topic sentence, link sentence is also key. You can still preserve all of your evidence. You can have the same sentence starters for the most part. But how you explain it, those little links, you might have to tweak a couple of words. Maybe you have to substitute a word in for the word of the question. But that is lighter than what you have to do in the introduction and topic sentences. Okay, so that's the level to which you have to adapt. Now, here's the basic process. Again, there are those micro questions or mini questions to ask. We've been over that, so hopefully you've noted those questions down. But of course, the first step, what I want you to do on the day of the exam, is not to start writing your first sentence straight away once you read the essay question. It's to identify the key terms, ask these questions, try and come up with a little answer for each of them, and then relate key terms together. You'll often only find 2 or 3 key terms in a question. And we'll do one practice in a moment before we finish. So there are the steps. Identify key terms, so like underline them or mentally note them. For each of those terms, ask yourself what type, how, who, what, so what. You don't have to answer all of those little questions, but they're little prompts to you to think, how can I answer them and link in what I already wanted to say? And you have to practice that, of course. And then how do I relate these different keywords together? And that might be simple, that might require a little bit more thought, but that's the first thing you need to think about before you start writing. And then obviously you have to be very efficient with writing and make those adaptations along the way. Okay, example. Let's finish strong here. Here's a question. The greatest stories, and everyone can do this, this is for human experiences, right? Storytelling is a key word in your rubric. The greatest stories are those which both confront and enlighten. To what extent does your study of your prescribed text support this statement? What do we think are the key words of the question? How many are there? You've got to account for both sentences. What do we think are the key terms? And when I say key terms, what are the words that you should be using all throughout your essay? Not necessarily all together. It's good to separate them, always separate them and differentiate them. But what are the words that you would use a lot of throughout the essay? And I want to make it clear here, when I say key terms, I'm talking about the words you have to use in the essay. So we've got confront, enlighten, correct. Anyone who said confront and enlighten, they are clearly 2 key words that you will have to use a lot of. Here's a key tip for that. You don't just have to use those forms of the word. Confront in, confronted, confrontational, enlightenment, enlighten in. Any derivative of the word is fine, but use that actual word. Don't use shock instead of confront. Does everyone understand that? Use the actual word. So the 3 key words are stories, confront, and enlighten. They're the words that you would use. We're not talking about to what extent or how or anything like that. We're talking about the actual words you should use a lot of. Stories, you might use storytelling. All right, well, thank you very much. I'm going to end it now, but one thing you should all know that we run a mastermind kind of game show. It'd be great revision for you to come on, assess your understanding of techniques and things like that. You'll be competing for a cash prize as well. So that's Jeddle Mastermind. Send us an email. You can do it through the Eventbrite link if you want to participate on that cash prize for the winner. So that would be cool. That's on the YouTube. Make sure you check out the YouTube channel for more things. Thank you so much for being on here. But otherwise, check out our socials, follow that. Thanks so much and good luck.